Episode 19. Attention Management. A refreshing breeze blew across the lawn, bringing with it the moisture of the waterfall. In the silence one could hear the smooth and melodic splashes of the water, flowing from the low cascading ledges, and the rustle of the leaves of trees that grew on the mountain slopes. A sense of unity and harmony with the surrounding world descended on the students. They froze, catching the magic of the moment, completely surrendered to the surging sensation, and when it dissolved in the warm sunlight, the people stirred again and livened up. Their faces were full of inspiration, and their eyes sparkled with delight from what they had just experienced. The teacher smiled mysteriously and indicated that he expected new questions. Then Rita, the cute young brunette, raised her hand. "Teacher, do I understand correctly that attention management is meditation?" the girl asked. "When we look inwards and outwards at the same time." "This is the Dharma stage already. There we study where the attention is directed, and we do it by way of concentration. We concentrate on the dot and observe how this attention works and why we cannot look at it for a long time. It seems like a simple action. Just look at the dot and that is it. And it turns out that it is not easy at all, because attention is constantly distracted. The eyes seem to be looking at the dot, but the attention has already flown elsewhere. And that is when we begin to observe attention and begin to feel it. This is the stage of dharana. And dhyana is the next stage, when we turn our attention inwards and begin to see our own internal processes. So we return to ourselves, to our Atman. "Beloved teacher," Rita spoke again, "can we say that different situations, different external stimuli, lead our attention such as inner desires and thoughts? How do we get it back?" "There is one example of objective art," said the sage, "a picture in which a person is depicted as a house where thieves have broken into, and so they act there at their own will." "What kind of thieves are they?" asked Rita. "Our thoughts, emotions, feelings of hunger, cold, thirst, they all steal our attention. It does not realize itself, does not understand what it is, does not see how everything happens inside. It is simply identified and involved in this process. And if the attention has realized itself and begins to observe the processes taking place inside, the identification stops, and it becomes difficult to steal it." "And what exercises are better to begin with?" Eric joined the conversation again, "so that the attention becomes aware of itself." "You can start with simple exercises, observing your breathing, feeling the taste of food during a meal. The attention is trained bit by bit, and we gradually begin to manage it. Then, in a difficult situation, we say to ourselves, 'Stop,' and we begin to separate, to disidentify." "And concentration exercises?" asked Rita. "Which of them are the most effective?" "Concentration on breathing, on steps, on food, on a dot, on anything," the master began to explain. "When we concentrate, we try to control our attention by willpower, focus on it, and stay focused. If we have succeeded, we move on, and it is no longer someone else who controls our attention, but we ourselves begin to manage it." "Tell me, When we practice in a group, what is its main task? Wondered Lana. To awaken a person and direct his attention inwards? To help to get rid of everything? To awaken the spiritual part in a person? Yes, the keeper confirmed, and began to explain in a measured manner. When your fellow man simply says to you, "Wake up," you are already waking up. Someone says it, then another one, then yet another. We wake up every time we hear such commands, and then we think, "Oh, what have I identified with? What is ruining me? And why don't I see the processes inside me again? Why am I living in the outside world again mechanically, absolutely not understanding what is happening to me?" If such awakenings occur, the group helps in this, and then help is especially needed when a sharp corner has occurred, some kind of difficult situation. The like-minded people around us help us cope with the negativity. It is difficult for a person to cope with his negative emotions, and when a lot of people unite and begin to help him, then it becomes much easier for him. And what happens to attention when we sleep? Arena asked, coming a few steps closer to the keeper. Awakening is when you become aware of your attention and feel it, and a deep sleep is when there is attention, but you are not aware of it. That is, it is dispersed on everything, right? It is either dispersed, meaninglessly wandering over various things, associations, or, on the contrary, it is very strongly identified with something. And then a person begins to suffer from some specific problem. That is, in the state of sleep, attention has two positions, either painful identification or senseless stupor. And the third state occurs when we begin to wake up, and attention begins to slowly return to its source. Arena looked at the sage with gratitude. "Thank you for the clarifications, teacher," she said with trepidation, and pondered. It was clear that just at the moment, a tense mental process was going on in her head. It turns out that consciousness sends its dispersed spotlight, and attention in any case passes through all the 5 centers. And then most of the attention is directed to the leading center, right? For example, if a person is sex-crazed, then the light goes through the sexual center, and if he is excessively concerned about food, then it goes through the instinctive center. Do I understand correctly? Yes, that is right, the keeper of knowledge confirmed. More light goes to the leading center, and attention is not always evenly distributed. For example, if a person is in a neutral state, then the light goes evenly, and then something outweighs it. For example, a person sees a plate with delicious food, and the instinctive center steals the spotlight, and the person begins to greedily absorb the food. And at this moment, he does not notice anything, or does not see what is around, and his attention is completely absorbed in the process. "Teacher, can I give you another example?" Vlad asked. And when the sage looked at him approvingly, he began to speak. For example, a student came to a darshan, sees the teacher for the first time, and looks only with the emotional or sexual center, but does not hear what he is talking about. And therefore, he does not understand the essence, nor does he receive the knowledge. He tries to perceive everything with the emotional center, what the teacher is wearing, how he behaves, how he moves. It is not clear for the person what the event is about, because the intellectual center is not turned on. The emotional center has stolen the spotlight, so the person receives impressions only from the emotional center. "A good example, Vlad," the sage praised the student. "It clearly shows that our 5 centers do not always work equally. When a person is in the right state, they can assess the situation evenly. And this is how they should work. But more often than not, one center steals the spotlight, and that is it. The person is identified and cannot perceive anything else. At this moment, another student wanted to speak out. It was a gaunt, middle-aged man with tan skin and wrinkles around his eyes. "I remember one example, too," he said, raising his hand. "It happened to my university friend Max, but I witnessed the situation and remembered it." The man took a deep breath and continued. "So we were about 20 years old at that time, and we were going on a bus to attend classes at the university. And at one of the stops, a very beautiful girl with a delicate figure, waist-length hair, and tight shorts got on. She was so tempting, so feminine. Max and I looked at each other then, and I saw his eyes widen and light up, and he somehow tensed up. How funny he looked." The narrator smiled, remembering this story. "Now I understand that at this moment the sexual center took all the attention, and the other centers completely turned off. But I didn't understand it then. I tried to say something to him, but he turned his gaze to this girl and froze like that, with his jaw hanging open. He couldn't say a word more, and he was literally drooling because of the surging desire. Just imagine." There was a wave of laughter among the students. Many imagined this scene, and this caused a natural reaction, but everyone laughed kindly, without malice. As always, they were ready to laugh at themselves, exaggerating their own mistakes. "And at this moment," the man continued, and sustained a dramatic pause, "the ticket inspector came to us. I showed my ticket. Now it was Max's turn, and he still didn't perceive or notice anything, except for this girl. The inspector asked him for a ticket, and he looked at him with dazed eyes, as if he was not here at all. I tried to wake him up, but it turned out to be useless. So I had to pay for him, and then Max missed his bus stop, too. Only when the girl got off did he begin to recover. That's what happens when the sexual center gets out of control." The student smiled again, and light chuckles could be heard here and there. The keeper of the knowledge also smiled, his bright, transparent smile. "Another illustration of how the centers can steal the spotlight," he said, summing up a kind of summary of what had been said. "One center takes all the attention, and the others can turn off altogether. And then perception becomes so narrow that a person does not perceive anything else." "Teacher, how are we to avoid this?" asked Rita. "I mean, how do we prevent this stealing of the spotlight?" "Try to perceive the situation evenly with all the 5 centers," the sage replied, "and make sure the necessary center is turned on, at our own will as the occasion requires, and not automatically. The spotlight of consciousness passes through our centers. We identify with them and perceive everything through them. And if the centers do not work correctly, or one center outweighs, then such a situation occurs, as in the example, and we no longer perceive everything for real." The keeper of the knowledge answered the girl's question, and silence reigned around him for a short moment, broken only by the noise of the waterfall, and the noise of the wind entangled in the pause of the century-old pines that grew on the slope. "Teacher, who can distribute the attention?" Irina asked a new question. "Does the deputy manager do this, so to speak? Or how does it happen so that it is done consciously?" "If a person was born and brought up correctly, then each center manifests itself in time when it is necessary," the sage explained. "Or, if he was born and brought up incorrectly, but then he met a teacher, and he told him about everything, then this very manager begins to form. And with the help of its will, it begins to distribute attention to the centers, turning on some of them while turning off the others. "Teacher, but I don't quite understand," Irina began again. "How can all the centers work evenly and simultaneously? After all, for example, if a person eats, his instinctive center prevails. It would be strange if at this moment the sexual center turned on with the same force as the instinctive one. Or, for example, if there is intellectual activity, then why do we need the instinctive center? And if, for example, during intellectual activity, other centers will be turned on, and if they are evenly turned on, will intellectual work be done normally?" Expressing her doubts, Irina looked questioningly at the keeper of the knowledge, and he gave her an answering look, full of love and understanding. "Your question suggests that you want to get to the heart of things," he said approvingly. "Look, if a person is not busy with anything, all his centers perceive the world around him evenly. And then, as the occasion requires, some center that is needed is turned on, but the other centers must watch it too. Let us say, as in our example, that is when the ticket inspector approached Max. Then either the emotional or the motor center should be activated. He should have thought that he needed to show the ticket, or at least be scared. If the intellectual center had been monitoring the situation, it would have turned on first, and then Max would have started thinking what to do. Apologize, look for the ticket, somehow explain himself to the inspector, or better run away or get off the bus. In any case, Max would have found a way out of the situation. If he had decided to run away, then he would have switched to the motor center. But it so happened that the sexual center took all his attention, and the other centers turned off altogether, so they just stopped working." "But when the attention is in the imagination," Vlad asked, getting back into the dialogue. "For example, if a person sees a house in his imagination, do the same centers turn on when he sees a real house or not?" "Yes, exactly the same centers are activated. Imagination replaces reality, and we react to it in the same way, as if something is really happening. Imagine, for example, what would happen if a cat's attention was directed to its own imagination. It would seem to it that a mouse is running around the room very quickly, although in fact it is not there. What would happen?" The students pondered, imagining this picture. Smiles appeared on their faces. Eric decided to answer. "Well, probably the cat would be constantly rushing around the room from corner to corner, jumping on the walls, hissing, attacking this imaginary mouse, and it would seem to it that it was catching and eating it." But he could not help laughing as he shared his interpretation. Smiles appeared on the students' faces again. "So we are in the same state," said the sage. "We are sitting in an empty room and nothing happens. But if the imagination works, it makes all the centers work incorrectly. They react to an illusion, to hallucinations, to something that is not real. And if all the centers react to the imagination in this way, then is the imagination itself the product of the intellectual center, or all the centers?" asked Lana. "This is the product of the intellectual center, basically," the keeper replied, after listening to the question. "It creates imagination, images, and all the centers use this. And in fact, our task is to make this spotlight turn around and realize that it is now in the imagination, right?" Lana asked again, getting closer to the realization of the truth, step by step. "Must we understand that attention wanders?" "Yes," the teacher confirmed. "You need to direct the spotlight beam inwards. And it does not matter whether a person has seen this notional house in reality or in his imagination. When the beam turns inwards, then the person understands that it turns out that I have different centers and they work differently. It turns out that different selves, different personalities are activated in me. I am divided into many personalities and roles, and I am not one. And so the person gradually sinks into himself. He goes deeper and deeper. And then what? And then the center from which attention comes, and this center is Atman, the divine particle of our soul. After listening to the answer, Lana nodded gratefully, without stopping for inner thoughts, and from the expression on her face, the sage saw that she was hesitating whether to ask about something or not. He looked warmly at the student, without words encouraging her to continue the dialogue. Feeling a wave of acceptance and warmth emanating from the master, she spoke again. "Teacher, but when we did the acceleration practice," the woman began, "it turns out that we accelerated at all the centers, right? We thought faster, moved faster, and reacted more emotionally to everything?" She paused a little, inhaling the fresh mountain air, and gathering her thoughts, then she continued. "I remember my feelings. When this acceleration happens, you feel such a heat, and then at some point, you stop and realize that life is bubbling inside you. So what is this feeling, I wonder? Does it come from the intensive work of the centers, from their energy?" "Yes," the keeper answered unequivocally. "The emotional, motor, and intellectual centers are activated. We feel this life when the movement of energy begins. Just when it accelerates, it begins to feel stronger. This energy is always there. Even when we do everything slowly, it is also a movement, but it is so weak that we do not notice it. And when we begin to accelerate, the movement of energy is stronger, and we begin to feel it. We immediately begin to notice our breath, to understand that we, in fact, are breathing, that our heart is pounding. Everything becomes clearer, more palpable, more noticeable for us." "Is this acceleration useful for all the centers?" Vlad decided to clarify. "Does it give us more life?" "It is useful," the sage replied with a warm smile. "We can actually work much faster. This is one of the types of super effort. If we are able to do something twice as fast, then we need to do it. This develops us, and if we start doing the same thing twice as slowly, then there is an inevitable degradation." Vlad smiled back at the sage, having listened to his answer with sincere gratitude. And at that moment, a new question was asked, this time by Rita. "And if our consciousness works as a spotlight and feeds the centers with its light, then what does consciousness itself feed on?" "A very good question," said the keeper of the knowledge, and looking at the sun that was at its zenith, began to explain. "Consciousness receives impressions from our 5 centers. They work like camera lenses. With the help of attention, they are adjusted back and forth, and the whole image eventually falls on the matrix, into Atman, our divine part of the soul. This light is projected onto it, and it gets all the impressions. The centers themselves do not receive these impressions, but rather shapes them. The sexual center shapes impressions in its own way, the emotional one in its own way, the intellectual one in its own way. They process the surrounding information, create certain sensations, and then it all goes into Atman." The girl's face lit up with understanding, but immediately a new question flashed in her eyes, and Rita decided to ask it right away. "But when I shift my attention to my body parts in a circle, I feel a tactile sensation," she began, remembering and trying to describe in as much detail as possible her experiences received during the practice. "I feel energy like a ray, like a zipper slider that runs all over the body. It's physically palpable, but other students feel differently." "Yes," Arena chimed in, For example, my ajna starts to throb. Is this normal? Yes, it is fine, the sage nodded with a smile. Everyone begins to feel differently. Someone feels warmth inside. Someone has pulsation. Another feels energy physically. It is important that we have already begun to understand that we are attention. We realize that if I have directed my attention to my right hand, then I may not feel the rest of the body at all. And then we do not feel the body and ask ourselves, where did it go? Why is it not felt entirely, but only the right hand? And we answer ourselves, but because, it turns out, I am attention. Where I am, that is what I feel. It is very important not just to understand it with the mind, but to feel it, to experience it. Then the realization will come that I am attention, not the body, not thoughts, not emotions. There must be a very deep experience of the moment that I am attention. This should arise, and then we already begin to understand a lot. And how is imagination related to the subtle world? Arena asked again. You said that if a cat reacted to imagination like a human, it would rush up and down in search of an imaginary mouse. It turns out that our fantasies, do they exist in the subtle world, or is it only our reality? Imaginary objects exist on the mental plane, the sage began to explain. Let us say we saw a jackalope, and we ask ourselves, is it real or is it not? So what do you think? Is it real? He turned to the students, urging them to reflect on the question. Well, if it is only on the mental plane, then, of course, in reality it doesn't exist, Rita replied, smiling involuntarily. After all, we all understand that there are no jackalopes. She looked slyly at her fellow students. We understand, don't we? Laughter rang out among the students. That is just the point, the keeper spoke up again. Our fantasies about the jackalope are real, but only on the mental plane. If a person thinks that the jackalope exists only in his head, then everything is fine. But as soon as the person begins to look for it on the physical plane, this already indicates that he is sick with schizophrenia and needs to be put in a hospital and have injections. The sage paused, assessing the reaction of the students. And why is that? Asked Eric. Why can a person think that the jackalope is real? He is mixing up the planes. He is looking for something in reality that exists only on the mental level. As long as he understands that it was on the mental plane that I saw the jackalope, then everything is fine, and he perceives everything adequately. When he does not understand that the jackalope is on the mental plane, but thinks that it must exist on the physical plane, then this speaks of pathology. The teacher paused again for a while, looking into the distance, and continued with a slight mysterious smile. In fact, almost all people are such schizophrenics. The student stared at him with incomprehension. But how? Rita was amazed. Don't we know how to distinguish the mental plane from reality? We understand that there are really no jackalopes. The keeper smiled with a slight sadness. Yes, it is so in the case of jackalopes, he said. But in ordinary life we so often confuse the planes. For example, a person saw an advertisement for some pyramid scam and believed in it, and he decided to invest all his money to get 100 times more. And this advertisement, this information was formed on the mental plane. But the person thinks that it will be on the physical level. But in the end, it all remained at the level of imagination. Is it like with Pinocchio? Lana asked ironically. He was promised great success in Stromboli's puppet show, but it didn't turn out so well because the fox and the cat had promised him all that on the mental plane. and in the end all he got was some broken metal washer, and then he was locked up in a cage. Yes, this is also a good example. The sage nodded benevolently at the words of the student. Therefore, when a person confuses the planes and does not understand what happens on which plane, that is when he starts to have problems. Teacher, and here's what I wanted to ask, the woman continued. When I have a lot of different tasks at once, and I observe what I direct my attention to, and at the same time, I try to focus on all these tasks, I feel tension accumulating later, and an inadequate reaction occurs in the emotional center, and negative emotions appear. Is this normal, that the emotional center reacts so inadequately, but then through this I understand my mistakes? Or do I need to learn in some other way? Lana, this is a very good practice, the keeper approved. The more objects our attention can hold, the more our attention begins to expand and develop. Someone can hold 2 objects, someone can hold 3. Therefore, it is necessary to try to remember as many things as possible. For example, to build a detailed plan for the day, such as what needs to be done today and at what time, scheduling everything by the hour and minute. And then when the time comes, we will have to remember and start doing what we have written down. Thank you, teacher, Lana said with sincere gratitude. I will definitely try this practice. But you may not succeed right away, the sage warned. You need to train a lot, because you were taught incorrectly at school. There had to be some kind of psychological games to remember different objects, to stay focused for a long time, or to solve multiple tasks at the same time. And only then would our attention have developed correctly. But they did not teach us anything about it. They just told us to memorize some equations and formulas. When we have to pay attention to a lot of tasks, our attention begins to expand, and it becomes more concentrated, focused. And the negative reaction of the emotional center, the woman asked doubtfully, is this really normal? Yes, the sage reassured the student, sending her a soothing look full of love. There is pressure in ajna for a large number of tasks that need to be controlled. And that is when we begin to develop, because we can control more and more things with our attention. And for this, we enter into a more and more collected state, because in a vague state, in a half-asleep state, it is impossible to control anything with our attention. For example, something is said at a darshan, and 1 minute later, the student forgets what has just been said. Do I understand correctly that there is no need to get upset and identify with something if something didn't work out? Eric asked. We need to take it easier, right? The guy looked at the sage inquisitively. Should we regard it as the process of studying or a game, and then over time the attention will expand? Yes, you need to say to yourself, now I will become even more collected. I will concentrate even more, and I will be even more attentive. Then I will be able to solve more problems. What usually prevents us? The teacher looked questioningly at the guy, but immediately after a short pause continued the explanation. A vague state does, so we do not remember half of what we are told. The more collected our state is, the more we begin to remember and embrace with attention. For example, as we do in a stressful situation, if there is some kind of attack on us, then we need to become collected, concentrated, to mobilize our reserves. Then we are able to dramatically expand our attention, to solve many tasks at once. And such a collected state arises because of stress. And if they tell us something and 1 minute later we no longer remember anything, the guy asked again, what does that mean? That we are in a senseless state, the teacher said. Even when we have just been told something, it is distorted in our brains and have perceived it in a wrong way. We often do not hear our interlocutors. They tell us one thing, but we hear and understand something completely different, because we are not used to being in a collected state. "Teacher, may I tell my story?" Vlad suddenly asked, stepping forward. The sage indicated with an approving gesture that he was looking forward to hearing the story, and then the student began. "I was often beaten by bullies at school." Noticing the surprised glances of his friends who stared at this muscular, tattooed, strong man in bewilderment, Vlad stopped and smiled kindly. He really did not look like a man who was beaten by school bullies, and he knew it, too. Yes, he explained, spreading his hands and smiling. "Now, it's hard to believe, but at school I was completely different. A skinny, frail, sickly child. My parents forced me to play the violin, which complemented this image of a nerd with glasses and a fiddle bow." He talked about it so fervently and cheerfully, and the contrast with how Vlad looked and behaved now was striking, which had a comic effect and made the student smile. "So I was often beaten, and I had to be in a collected and attentive state," Vlad continued his story. "You had to see that. I went out of the apartment and thought, is there a danger around? Is someone waiting for me at the door? It was getting ridiculous. I didn't leave the house until I listened carefully. I walked, looked with all my eyes, breathed softly, and went down the stairs so carefully. I constantly thought, what if there are these hooligans on the playground? Then I have to hear them in time, in advance, before they hear me and see me. Then I walked out of the building and looked in all directions again. Then I went to school, where there were a lot of bullies. And so, I was in a tense state every day. I was constantly waiting for where the danger might come from." Vlad grinned again, with slight irony to himself about the past, remembering how it was. "And that's how I began to enlighten," he continued. "And my essence began to develop, because I was in this state for a long time." The students now looked at Vlad with admiration. Cheers and even occasional applause could be heard here and there. "Thank you for sharing your story with us," the keeper said approvingly. "You are a great fellow, because you understand and realized all this, because you used this situation for your own growth and development. And if I had gone to school in a senseless state, nothing would have formed in me. My essence would not have developed," Vlad summed up his story. "That is why, if we have such a task, to remember as much as possible, to encompass with attention, then we need to turn on the emotional center so that it remains active," the keeper of the knowledge explained again. "And then we can do it all easily, but in a senseless state, we cannot do anything." When Vlad stepped back into the crowd, Tasha raised her hand. "Teacher, you say that where our attention is directed, that's what we become, and our world narrows to this ray," she began her question. "Tell me, do I understand correctly that on the path of spiritual development, our main task becomes to remember our Atman and expand it to our divine essence, to God? Am I right?" "First, at least just look inside yourself," the sage replied. "We observe ourselves. We look at how the centers work. Which self has arisen? If we start seeing them, noticing all these internal processes, then we will be able to go deeper inside ourselves. And if we do not see anything of this, then we will be able to see God only in the imagination, on the mental plane. And if we see all the centers, all the processes within ourselves, then we will reach Atman and will be in an enlightened state." "Teacher, Do I understand correctly that obedience is to completely give control of your attention to spiritual mentors? Tasha asked again. Yes, that is right, the Keeper of the Knowledge confirmed. Generally, what is the essence of obedience? A person cannot force himself to develop normally. He will either do nothing at all, which happens in most cases, or do what he easily succeeds in, and what is pleasant to him. Is this wrong? Rita clarified, continuing the flow of questions. Do we have to do what is difficult? To always do what a person likes and what he can easily do is to stop developing, the teacher explained. Therefore, it is necessary to do what he does not succeed in, what is difficult to do, and what needs to be cultivated and developed. And for this, he should find another person, a spiritual mentor or teacher, and this person tells him specifically what to do, what exercises to do, and how to work on himself. The person has enough strength for this, and he begins to do everything that is needed, and develops like this. And he would hardly have forced himself. And even if he forces himself once today, he will do it the next time only in a year. This person will never be able to develop in this way. And if he listens to a mentor or teacher, then he begins to work out what is unpleasant to him, which he could never do in any way or was too lazy for. Therefore, there must be a mentor who will help us do what is difficult, what is unpleasant, and what we do not want to do. Then there will be development. And if we do not have such a mentor or a team of like-minded people who are also engaged in spiritual growth, then we can only read books and dream about how we would come to enlightenment, but do nothing done to achieve this. Teacher, I have quite a specific question, Lana said, joining the conversation again. Let's say I observe my identification during the day and know that I need to do some tasks that I have planned. And then the spiritual mentor suddenly gives me another task, and I immediately have an identification that I will not have time for something now. How can this identification be removed? It is difficult to readjust, the teacher shook his head understandingly. Yes, if there are different tasks and you need to switch between them quickly, it can be quite difficult. This is so not only in training, but in general in anything you do. For example, someone says to us, "Let's go eat," and we are already overjoyed and even feel the aromas of the dishes being prepared. We can almost imagine how the juicy food gives us the pleasure of taste, and our mouth literally waters. That is, we have completely identified with it. But then we are told, "No, wait, we need to wash the kitchen floor first." What will you feel? The keeper smiled, describing the situation in colors and looking questioningly at the students. A complete disappointment, Eric said with a kind of irony, and laughed. Is it possible to disappoint expectations that much? The other students appreciated the joke, and mischievous laughter rolled through the crowd. Yes, said the teacher when the wave of gaiety had subsided, but we have already identified that there will be delicious food right now, and everything inside us is protesting. But we do not want to clean up the kitchen now, but only to eat, because we have prepared for it. But what should be done? What should we do to get rid of this inertia? We should be in a more detached state, not identified with a task or a specific action. You have to think like this. Anything can happen now, and if necessary, I will start cleaning up right away or do another task. I am not identified, so I will calmly begin washing the kitchen floor. And then, if we are given a new command, we easily perceive it and start doing it. And if we are identified, then the reaction is, "No, why? I must eat. Where is my portion?" The student smiled again, seeing the teacher exaggerate the situation. And if such a state of identification occurs, the sage continued, and then we are suddenly told that instead of eating, we need to go for a walk, for us it is a great relief. Oh, why? I was going to eat, and now I have to go for a walk. Why would I do that? The keeper smiled again, and sincere smiles could be seen on the students' faces. Therefore, we must remain in a more detached and more inert state, ready to readjust and do something else at any moment, and then we will really develop spiritually. Today's spiritual conversation was very long and intense. The students received answers to all their questions and studied human attention from different angles in order to build a complete picture. Seeing that they needed time to put the acquired knowledge in their heads, the sage began to chant the stanzas of the poem, and his smooth voice sounding over the clearing, intertwining with a melodious murmur of the mountain waterfall. I look at the symbol of the morning dawn. I look outside, but its essence is inside. That clear light is the basis of everything. It illuminates the dreams of our dreams. Let the prana of the sun burn through me, the sacred eye closed in the depths. That eye of wisdom that sheds the truth when you start realizing things. Look more attentive at the world. It is but a symbol of what is within. We invite you to join spiritual seminars, workshops, and retreats hosted by the Leader Masters. Reveal your superpowers, find your predestination, and accumulate power to gain well-being and bring your goals to life. Send an email saying, "I want to join the seminar" to our mailbox, and we will give you all the information. See you soon.